Five Fat Pigs, a Sven Kingdom's novella, by Angus Rorison. Chapter 1. Micheal. Micheal Inn was the greatest of chefs in the best job in the most splendid location in all the Sven Kingdoms. No one appreciated their food, or those who made it, more than the Nomasinans. They were renowned for their flamboyancy and extravagance, and right then she was passing one of the more extreme examples of both of these things, the summer palace. Palace is not a word that began to do justice to it. It was more of a walled city, shining elegantly in the crisp, clean light reflecting off the lake to the west. Its ramparts were bedecked with flags, turrets, and neatly turned-out soldiers strutting like peacocks in season along its imposing walls. It was filled with courtyards containing shimmering pools and fountains in which the royal family and their most cherished subjects would cool off during the long, hot summer days. Vaults filled with priceless wine and gardens planted with exotic plants from all corners of the known world. For Micheal, though, it was the kitchen that she craved. It was the mother of all kitchens. It was so wide it had a track running from one side to the other where servants would pull the head chef in his or her custom-made trolley from the east wall to the west. It had 4 great fires, larders the size of villages, a school for training sous chefs and waiters, and permanently employed knife sharpeners. The job of head chef was coveted across the entire continent, and it was almost hers. There was but one hurdle. The choice of head chef would be made at that summer's festival of Basta Mo Pasta, an 8-day celebration of food and drink which was the highlight of the Nomasinan social calendar. That was her chance. She would be overseeing a meal for a collection of the fussiest, most discerning dignitaries. They were the elite with the most refined taste buds in the kingdom. The king himself, of course, would be absent. He had gone mad and taken to living alone in a white tower, spitting at passers-by and living off baskets of tomatoes and bread hoisted up to him every 2 days. His son Fernando, though, was quite the gourmand and bon vivant, but he, too, would not be attending. He would be sending one of his 7 sisters to evaluate and report back. Micheal had to get it right. She was the favourite, she had to succeed, to deliver. There was, however, one snag. Unfortunately, it was the pork that they had begged for again. Many had sampled it at her restaurant, the Flat Buck. The succulent chops, softened in boiling cream, surrounded by glazed cabbage heart julienne and rosemary buttered potatoes, a new exotic vegetable brought north by intrepid Nomasinan pirates. It was her signature dish, the one that would excel her from celebrity chef to superstar, working in that kitchen. She stared at the palace. It gleamed back at her in the bright sunshine. But why was this a snag? What was the hitch in the plan? It was the neighbours. Hughesles sat at the centre of the Sven Kingdoms. That was as far as the central metaphor extended. It was central to no one's plans or conversations, except recently when it had been causing more trouble than usual. Hughesles had little or nothing going for it, but it did have a lot of pigs. The surfeit of pigs in that poor downtrodden nation had festered in their pens, letting loose an apocalyptic pandemic of pig pancreatitis. Infection into the human population had to be curtailed. For Micheal and her signature dish, it made things very difficult. The disease had spread rapidly, and the porcine population of Nomasina had been decimated. What pigs that there were left were not to be touched. Inspectors hithered and thithered in official wagons ready to condemn whole flocks. They had found few survivors of the pest from the east. In normal times, Micheal was the doyenne of the local saucing brigade, able to find impeccable ingredients within a half-day's ride. But no longer. Not where pork was concerned, at least. Ironically, the tide had begun to turn in Hughesles, and it was there that some clean animals were to be found. But where exactly to find them? She had no experience of Husles. Who did? Who would want to go there when Nomosina had it all? She had been forced into drastic action. Outsourcing. Chapter 2. Dean. Where the bleeding hell have you been all night then? Oh, shut your mouth, you filthy old codger. I swear one of these days I'm gonna... Gonna what, eh? Sharmina pushed her face as close as she could bear to that of her father's. She couldn't get too close. Bristles and the smell of rotten meat and ale permeated from his disturbing visage. He cracked first, swinging his face away from his daughter, the difficult middle child. Oi, missus, have you had a word with your daughter about where she's been? Mrs., his wife, not known by any other name, shied away and scurried back inside the house. He picked on someone else. Oi, Laquisha, you're the eldest. You were supposed to be looking after her. Oh, bog off, came the reply. Do it yourself. There was a crash from the other side of the yard. One of the many carts slipped an axle and the front toppled as metal and wood scraped against each other. Oh, gods, is that Alfie? Cried the father in despair. Someone please get that boy out of the way. He's a flipping liability. He dragged a dirty hand across his grimy face, tugging loose skin with it. Sharmina made a bolt for it, dashing into the house after her mother and slamming every door she encountered. The father sighed. He looked around despondently at his yard, full of old carts that he was supposed to be fixing up to sell. He wasn't getting any younger, and none of his 3 children looked like they wanted to ease his burden of work in any way. All I need is a break, he muttered to himself. He looked heavenwards, hoping that one of the gods might suddenly provide. Ominous clouds were gathering. He really should get some of the older, rustier carts under cover. He trudged melancholically towards the yard gate, staring at his muddy boots. This is why he didn't see the visitor arrive. Dean, that you, mate? He looked up. Yes, me. He lifted a finger, waggled it a little, then stuck it into a corner of his mouth. It slipped easily into one of the many holes afforded by missing teeth. The visitor looked at him smugly and put his hands into his breeches. Lee? Tried Dean. Darren? Nope. Dean scratched the side of his face. If he'd had phosphorus on his fingers, they probably would have caught fire. The visitor slowly pulled out a folded piece of paper so that Dean could see it. A look of hopeful recognition passed over Dean's craggy, weary face. Norman! The visitor's lips pursed and he shook his head. He turned the folded piece of paper around so that Dean could see the wax seal on the other side. Dean's mouth dropped open. No, can't be. The visitor grinned and nodded. Trevor? That's me, matey. Dean's hands went to his head in shock, amazement and joy. You mean it's a yes? Sure is, son. Read it yourself. Trevor handed over the letter. Dean opened it excitedly. It contained some words, of that he was sure. The words were formed by letters. He'd never figured out why they called something made up of loads of letters a letter, but still, who was he to question the intelligentsia? The letters, if in fact they were all letters, maybe there were some numbers, jumped about all over the page. He nodded sagely, as if reading. He looked up at Trevor and smiled. Excuse me, Trev, he said, and turned round, walking back towards the house. He found Laquisha, his eldest daughter, picking nits out of Alfie's hair on the porch. Here, Laquisha, give us a read of that, would you? He said quietly, surreptitiously handing the paper to her so that Trevor couldn't see. What's in it for me? She replied coolly, snatching the letter. Alfie took his chance and ran off back into the yard. Dean had bigger things on his mind than Alfie's mischief. I'll think of something. Go on, tell us what it says. Laquisha began to read silently, her lips moving as her finger followed the words. Well, pressed Dean. Blimey, it's from Nomosina, innit? Said Laquisha and continued. Duke something. Toro Semolina, I think. He wants you there to baste some pasta or something. Bastamo pasta, yes, it's a blinking festival. Oh yeah, blimey, it's all in foreign, ain't it? He says you take the goods and you get to keep the cart. What goods? Never you mind, my little treasure, never you mind. but it'll be the fanciest cart you ever set eyes on. Gonna flog that beauty and get us out of here." Dean grabbed the paperback and clutched it tight. "Well, I ain't going with you," blurted his eldest. This shook Dean out of his trance. "Oh, come on, love. You're the eldest. This is my biggest job." "Stop you right there, okay?" Laquisha put a finger up to his face and her other hand on her hip. "I read the bleeding letter, didn't I? Take somebody else." Dean looked crestfallen, but only for a moment. A thought passed through what passed for his brain. "Yeah," he smirked. "I'm going to take Sharmina, ain't I? Keep her out of trouble. Teach her a blinking lesson too." He rubbed his hands in glee at his cunning plan. He turned round and waved at the figure still standing at the entrance to his yard. "All right, Trev. Be with you in a minute. I reckon this calls for a swift one down the Dog and Duck." Chapter 3. Nina. "I'm international. I'm here, I'm there, I'm everywhere. Now, do you want them or not? Because if not, these are on the first boat out of here back to the faraway land on the other side of the ocean from whence they came." The dark-haired woman stood back and admired the panic on the face opposite her. She had also enjoyed using the word whence. She decided she'd use it a lot more in the future. The clattering and chattering of the marketplace were almost deafening. The heat added to the confusion and sense of urgency. She picked up 2 of the coconuts from the barrow in front of her and held them up at chest height. The man's hands fluttered about as if he was trying to fly, but was handicapped by a plethora of elastic bands wrapped around his wrists. She loved working in Nomacina. The people here were so highly strung she could wind them up and ping them at her will. She had chosen the name Nina as it sounded vaguely Nomacinan to her. But I don't know what to do with them," stuttered the flustered man. "Listen, mate," she said, leaning in. "It's nearly Bastamo pasta time, right?" He nervously nodded his head, desperately trying not to look at the 2 coconuts, but yet utterly fascinated by them. She pressed home her advantage. "Well, if you're half the chef you say you are, you'll figure something out. You want to impress? You got to give them something they've never seen before. You seen these before?" The chef shook his head. "Well then," she said, ever so slightly juggling the bizarre fruit so that she could watch him go cross-eyed, "let's make a deal." The moment was ruined by an almighty commotion as a wayward horse and cart smashed into the neighbouring stall, accompanied by a dozen cries of "Mamma mia!" and "Bubbidi-bubbidi" from the local traders. Nina saw little of it. She saw red. Not because of any flaring temper, though there was frustration aplenty, but because the neighbouring stall had been stacked high with tomatoes, fresh, juicy, large tomatoes that took to the air, covering the few feet between her and them in milliseconds. As the commotion died, which took a while, she licked her lips and wiped her face. Actually, the tomatoes were very good. Not surprising, given the famous fertility of the Nomacinan soil. However, just as she was cheering up and accepting that she was covered in tomato juice, she noticed her coconuts rolling away. This reignited the confusion as the wayward horse stumbled on the hard, round, foreign objects, causing another round of wailing and arguing and waggling of hands and fingers. As she scrabbled around on all fours in the dirt of the cobbled street, she reached for a rolling coconut, but it came to a sudden stop, clamped to the ground underneath an uncommonly clean and well-kept leather boot. Nina looked up, but the figure above her was silhouetted against the bright sky. "What are you doing down there?" said a voice seemingly from the clouds. It was a female voice, an authoritative one. Nina was no fan of authority. "Get off," she squealed. "Them's mine. Them's my coconuts." "Yours?" asked the voice. "Yes, mine," replied Nina impatiently. "All of them. They're worth something too, if you don't mind." Nina was blinded by sun rays as the figure crouched down. A middle-aged woman with neat, tied-back hair eyed her. "What are you doing crawling around in the street like some farm animal after these?" "Blimey!" exclaimed Nina, rocking back onto her knees and wiping her hands. "Them, my coconuts, my livelihood, okay? I went to a lot of trouble to get them, so if you don't mind." Nina went to grab the exotic fruit still trapped under the mystery lady, but she was denied. "Oi!" she cried. Tutted the woman, pulling the coconut away. "I'd like to know how you got hold of these." Nina wiped her face. This had the unintended consequence of making it even more dirty, but she wasn't thinking of that. She had smelt opportunity. "What do you do then?" asked Nina. "I'm a chef," came the curt reply. Cash registers rang inside Nina's head. "Well, I'm international. I'm here, I'm there. I get—" She gently prodded the lady with a finger. "I get what you want." The lady seemed impressed, despite the fact that she was looking at a grubby young woman scrabbling around on a market floor. "A hustler, eh? Well, I may have a little job for you." "Nina." "Micheal," said the other lady. Nina put out a hand to shake. Micheal cautiously accepted the outstretched limb. Chapter 4. 5 Fat Pigs. "I imagine you'll want the inspector round to give 'em a once over. I mean, these ones here is fine, but we got another pen, which is a bit—" The farmer wobbled his hand around in the air, using the universally known sign for dodgy. Dean nodded his head in understanding. The large, ruddy-faced farmer in front of him, leaning against the pen, snorted and pushed the palm of his hands upwards, hard against his runny nose. Dean flinched slightly. Sharmina, his younger daughter, still not married and still defiant, registered her disgust via some guttural sound whilst folding her arms. Dean was determined that she at least learn something of his trade, so that she could relate to an eligible tradesman or, gods forbid, fend for herself one day. He had no hope with his hyperactive son Alfie, no matter how many offerings his wife made to sky gods, money gods, or any other sort of celestial beings. "I mean," continued the farmer, continuing to stare straight ahead at his beloved animals, "if they're for export, you ain't going to take them lot over there. These ones is worth something." "Why wouldn't we take them?" asked Dean. "Well, now, you don't want to take the chance now, matey, does you? You got to be sure these days. Can't go selling them in foreign lands at great profit when they're a bit—" He wobbled his hand again. "I mean, I keep my certificates on me all the time, don't I? Got to be sure. Got every pig here registered clean. Well, I says every one, but I ain't including them lot." But they're so fat," pointed out Dean. The dodgy pigs were, in fact, as he had so well observed, very rotund. "Ha ha!" chuckled the farmer. "Well, of course they are. I've got to get rid of rotten food somehow, ain't I?" Dean stroked his bristles. Sharmina recognised this as a sign that he was up to something. "How much?" he asked. "How much for what? How many?" said the farmer, going to open the pen in front of them. No. Them ones," said Dean, pointing to the other pen. "Them, 5, added Sharmina from behind them. She'd spotted him mouthing numbers. 5 was quite a large one. He was used to dealing with 1 cart, 4 wheels, numbers like that. After that, counting became a chore. "What, them 5, the fat ones?" asked the farmer, turning round in disbelief. "Well, no one wants to buy 'em, do they? We'll take 'em, sling 'em on the cart, job's a good 'un," said Dean in a flurry, licking his lips in anticipation. The price was fixed. It was a lot less than the regular certified pigs. With some effort, and not a little help from the farmer and his son, the fat porkers were loaded onto the back of the cart. "Lovely jubbly," said Dean, handing over the coins to the bemused farmer. "You ain't going to sell 'em for no food, is you?" No, nah, of course not," lied Dean. He looked at the little party in front of him. The farmer's son was about Sharmina's age. "And of course, if our two want my daughter here is very handy. Pretty too, eh? Yours and mine could—" "Oh, shut it, you dirty bleeder!" screeched Sharmina, and turned her back on everyone, mounting the cart glumly. "Oh, right," muttered Dean. He'd never been much good at controlling her, except by physical force, which, given she was a woman now, was much frowned upon. He climbed the cart and was met by the full force of her glare. Footsteps squelched in the mud behind them, fading into the background of farm noises. All right, said Dean. "You just behave yourself." "You're right plonker, ain't you?" scowled Sharmina, once again avoiding the use of the word dad. "Boy, what's your mouth, girl?" snapped Dean angrily. "You reckon you're going to stroll into Bastamo Pasta with a load of diseased pigs and make a fortune, do you?" spat his daughter. Dean was taken aback by her front. She was getting bolder by the day. "No, my precious. I'm going to get them a certificate, ain't I? There's ways and means. Look and learn, love. Look and learn." "You donkey," she replied. Dean was about to snap and do something he'd likely later regret when Sharmina, moving deftly, brought something out from the folds of her clothing and waved it in front of him. It had words on it. He couldn't make them all out, but he'd learned the shape of the words at the top of a clean pig certificate. Instinctively, he lashed out, trying to swipe it from his daughter. She taunted, getting out of the way. Look and learn. I got this. It's mine. Nicked it off the old farmer. We're partners now. I'm getting something out of this trip and all. You little... Oh, I can tear it right up here. See if I care. Dean sat back defeated. The pigs squealed. Rain fell. Chapter 5. The Pheasant Plucker. Nina had a mission. She liked missions. It was what set her apart from the crowd, made her so much more than the average Joe. Or even Joe, without the E. Not that there were many women in her game, trading, finding goods, shifting goods, buying, selling, negotiating. That was her, and she was, so she liked to think, at the top of her game. Few people had her nous or her wile. That's why Micheal had spotted her. Not many people could get their hands on coconuts for starters. Few people even knew the island of Kukwak, where they came from, and they'd have a hard time pronouncing it even if they did. Micheal had even shown her to one of the palace's many side entrances, the one that supplied the kitchens she so desperately wanted to run. It was where the pigs were to be deposited, along with the all-important certificate that proclaimed them as free from the scourge of pancreatitis. Pigs, that was her mission now. The chef needed them badly, but where to find them? Inevitably, it had brought her east, to Hughesles. You could tell you were in Hughesles because the weather changed for starters. The sky greyed and people's clothes dulled, as did their conversation and their taste. None of the finery and colour of Nomesina there. No workshops filled with violin makers or tailors sewing fine linen drapes, or metal workers putting the finishing touches to ornate candelabras. Instead, there was the sound of hammers from a blacksmith, the churning of butter, or the smell of ale brewing. Yes, she thought, ale. That was it. There was only one place where she would find what she was after, or at least find someone who knew. A place where business was done, deals won and lost, reputations made and destroyed, sometimes within a single evening. The Pheasant Plucker. A large inn not far across the border. Not that there was an actual border. Some of it was fence, some river, some a track, and other parts just bramble-infested forest. As has been noted, it was more the change in ambience that informed you that you had left one kingdom and passed on into another. The pluck, as the locals called it, was out of town, far enough away from the prying eyes of the law, or at least far enough that a lookout would spot a sheriff coming. There was always room at the inn for one more. She hoisted her final bag onto the back of her chestnut-coloured mare and stared towards Hughesles in anticipation. It was cloudy and darkening as evening approached. There could be a long evening ahead, but hopefully it would be a profitable one. If not, more travelling would be required. Chapter 6. Brian. Oh, flippin' Nora, what now? Cursed Brian, jumping down from his cart. He landed with a squelch in the Hughslesian mud. It had been raining. He couldn't wait to cross over into Nomesina. For some reason, the gods seemed to bless that land. The sun shined and flowers grew there. But for now he was stuck with a shonky cart and still some way to go. He stared at the underside. Could be the axles, he mused, or more likely the bloomin' brake roller. He shook his head in despair. You right there, mate? Called a passer-by on a donkey. Not really, mate, replied Brian. Me bloomin' cart's on the blink again. Don't tell me. You been to see Dean, ain't you? Brian blew some air from his cheeks. How'd you guess? The passer-by chuckled. Second-hand cart salesman, all the same. Mind you, that Dean's a one-off. Don't suppose you could, tried Brian, but the donkey rider shook his head. Sorry, mate, wouldn't catch me on one of them. Don't know nothing about them. And he trotted off slowly on his overladen beast. Brian looked down at his own cart. Empty. Not the usual state of affairs, it must be stressed. He'd have to do better than this if he was to keep up with himself. He had to get to an inn before nightfall. If there's one thing Brian appreciated, it was a good inn. He loved the sight of them. When you approach from afar on a cold evening after travelling all day, you're cold and tired and need comforting, and you see the orangey glow of a fireplace and the creaky sign swimming in the breeze. And the smell of them too. That moment when you open the door and the mixed perfume of ale, burning wood, broth and human bodies fills your nostrils. Then, of course, the noise, the babble of voices that indicates company. Brian was a talker, a natural in a crowded inn. Perhaps there be a couple of musicians in one corner, one singing and playing spoons, the other with a fiddle or a hurdy-gurdy maybe. In fact, he loved inns so much that he'd bought one. It had been a good year and he could afford it, just. It was called the King Henry, and it lay in that river-crossed land to the south of the Palace of Hughes. Why it was called the King Henry no one could tell. As far as anyone knew, there had never even been a King Henry. He toyed with the idea of changing it to the King Brian, but he wasn't really that type to go naming things after himself. He figured the inn would bring in some money and give him time to go wheeling and dealing, criss-crossing the Sven kingdoms in search of great deals. However, the half-year following the purchase had been more difficult. His dearly beloved wife, who he often left in charge of his dearly beloved inn, was not the greatest of businesswomen. What she was good at was drinking, eating, gossiping, and generally frittering away any profit there might to be had. Still, it was fantastic to come home to his very own inn, with his very own seat at the bar and his very own tankard. That, however, still didn't help him with his current situation. He reckoned the cart would make it to somewhere for the night, but after that he'd have to exchange it or fix it. He needed a break, needed to sniff out a deal. Luckily, he knew he was on the right path. He scratched his head and looked ahead. Ah, food and drink, he said to himself, licking his chops at the sight of an inn ahead. One last haul ought to do it. Let's see what the Pheasant Plucker has got in store. Chapter 7. The Certificate. Sharmina had attended school, although to call it school was something of an overstatement. The village hall accepted children from weary parents and, for a small fee, would keep them busy for the day. It did, however, mean that she had the advantage of being able to read and write, unlike her father. But this was not where Sharmina's true talents lay. "Hold it steady, would you?" she snarled. "Don't get it dirty, will you?" Dean tried to hold the certificate steady whilst trying not to touch it too much. Sharmina concentrated, her tongue poked slightly out of the left corner of her mouth. For a few seconds, Dean saw the little girl he'd once liked. Maybe he had loved her, he couldn't remember. Whenever she started to cry or later scream and shout, he'd run off to the tavern to escape. Sharmina dipped the coarse cloth into the gin and lemon solution and gently began rubbing out the ink on the certificate. It was the closest father and daughter had been for years, both physically and in the fact of doing something together, having a shared goal for once. Dean was beginning to think that he was right to bring her along. For once the family would see him as a good father and not just a swindling drunk given to petulant fits of violence. "There, done it," said Sharmina, easing back and pushing her long hair away from her eyes. "Now what? Hang on, would you?" For a few minutes she blew on the paper and dabbed it with a dry cloth before leaning in again. Dean leaned in too. "Blimey, get up me light," she complained before carefully writing something. "Now have a look." Dean peered down at the certificate. There was a moment of blissful revelation. "It says Dean!" he exclaimed triumphantly. Sharmina looked pleased with herself. "You're now the owner of fine, clean pigs, ain't ya?" "Cool, nice one," said her dad. He went to pull her towards him for a hug, but she flinched instinctively, backing off. "Yeah, well, got to get this done right, ain't we?" she stated, holding the moral high ground. "Right, yeah," replied Dean awkwardly. "Well, this is it then. The big one. We're going to get 'em into Nomasina, Get to Baggio, huh? It's where the palace is, isn't it? It's where they have the Bastamo Pasta Festival. Yeah, that. Bound to be someone who'll buy some pigs. And then, of course, to see Signor... Dean fumbled around in his jacket for the other piece of paper, the long-awaited one brought to him by Trevor. He stared at the paper in vain. Sharmina tutted and took it off him. She scanned her eyes over it. "Ah, right. Duke Torremolincano has some goods for you at the palace to take." "Hang on. The palace?" "Yeah, the blinking palace. We're going to the blinking summer palace, babes. Best part is, I get to keep the cart he gives us." Dean's face was enraptured. "I bet it's going to be plush. Going to set me up for good, this one." He rambled on to himself for a while, but Sharmina had stopped listening. He'd given himself away with the me. He never did anything for the good of his family. He'd drink it away as usual. She had no future with him, and she couldn't help the rest of her family. She was on her own now. Eventually, Dean came to a halt. "Well, come on then," he said at last. "Let's leave this place. Gonna stop just before we cross the river into Nomiwhatsit. Trev said there's a good place to stop there." Oh no, thought Sharmina, not another inn full of more drunks. "Where's that then?" she asked weary. "The Pheasant Plucker. Supposed to be a good un." Chapter 8. The Evening. Nina liked to watch. It was how she began her evenings at establishments such as the Pheasant Plucker. Find a nice corner, eat a pie, have a drink or two, and watch the action unfold. Invariably, if anything evolved, it would be near the fireplace, so she snagged herself a cosy snug within touching distance of the fireplace and the door. There was the usual motley collection in that evening: local farmer types discussing the price of barley, tradesmen and their wives clinking mugs after a hard week in the workshops, travelling tinkers, but no mention of pigs. She was beginning to feel like a fisherman. She'd seen them sitting forlornly on the banks of rivers and lakes in all weathers. Never once had she seen one joyously lift his dinner from the water. She had, however, seen the scowl of the wives who'd turned up to collect them. She scowled to herself and downed another mug of tea. She was about to lift herself up and drag herself to the bar or hail a waitress, when the door flew open with a crash. A scruffy, rat-like man, supported by a young woman, fell through the door. They were followed by two more unkempt men. "Well, hey!" cried the man. Obviously, he had already made a start on his evening's drinking. "All right, landlord, give us four of your finest ales, a great big pie, and a room for the night, and a great big woman." The man, known to his friends as Dean, cackled at the two men behind him. The young woman thrashed about and threw him from her shoulder in disgust. He stumbled forward and grabbed the bar. The landlord was a large, mustachioed man with a frown. "Looks like you've already made a start, eh?" he said in reference to the man's lack of sobriety. "Yeah, mate, just the start," replied Dean, and clapped down a shower of coins on the bar. This placated the landlord, who set to work on Dean's order. Dean turned to gabble to his friends. "Fancy stumbling into you two, eh? This is the flocking, the furry, the furry pig." The three of them erupted into more laughter, but to Nina's ears they had said the magic word. She decided to observe some more. As the evening progressed, the landlord deposited the largest of his well-seasoned logs on the fire. He was expecting it to be a long evening. Nina was prepared for this as she stalked her prey. "This is it, lads, the big one, the big break. When I come back with the..." Dean just about managed to tap his nose conspiratorially. "I'm going to be made, aren't I? In fact, come with us. See the world, Ken. Come on. Look, let me buy you another drink. Hey, let's have another." As Dean's profligacy with his purse increased, so it did that with his tongue, and a small crowd gathered around him to hear his overblown tales and bragging. Inevitably, he let it slip. "Pigs? Yeah, I got pigs. Them ones out in the yard, they're mine. Don't you go getting no ideas. Had to pay that guard double. He's well tooled. Ain't no one nicking me pigs." "Where are you going with them, eh?" asked one man. "Market was yesterday. You missed out." "Market? Pah! I ain't got no piddling market, mate. I'm off to where the money is." Another man moved in. "Where the money is?" Everyone knew what that meant. "You mean over the river? Nomacina?" Dean waved his drink about as he swallowed a piece of meat pie. The questioner jumped back to avoid being showered in pie bits. "Course, mate, got it in one," ranted Dean. "This is the one. Trip of a lifetime. Take me daughter and all." He looked around for Sharmina, but she was not to be found. She was skulking in the cool night air outside. She'd fended off attention from one too many drunks and needed air. She was thinking about braving the crowd again, getting the key to her room and going to bed. Dean was pressed for further information. Nina subtly leaned in. No one had spotted she was earwigging. Where in Nomacina? It's that place, innit, with the food and the, Dean crossed himself. I know your game. No, I ain't telling you. Ain't giving nothing away. He immediately contradicted himself. I mean, the pigs ain't even the important bit. I'm going to sell them and then... "Sell them to me!" rang out a strong but female voice from one side. Unfortunately, Dean was in no mood to be rational. He stood to make a profit, but Nina stood to make a profit on top of his profit, and some more of his sober accomplices realised this. Nina was severely outnumbered. Half a dozen men spoke their mind, to Dean, to her, to the entire inn, who began to gather to see the spectacle. Would the bragging drunkard give in to the feisty woman, or would he stand his ground and get something in return? Chapter 9. Out the Bloomin' Spout and into the cup. Brian had trudged. He had trudged so far it was tragic. He was tortured and traumatised by the terrible torrent of trudging that had finally led him to the Pheasant Plucker. He was, to coin a phrase, tired and emotional. The inn looked especially inviting, with its orange glow, the babble of voices and the scent of cooking wafting forth. A young woman stood at the door. She turned around, having been peering through the thick glass. She was tutting at what she saw. Brian put his hands on his knees and caught his breath. "You all right, mate?" asked Sharmina. "Barely, love, barely. I must have walked halfway across the kingdom." "What, ain't you got no horse or cart?" "Cart? Don't mention carts to me, princess. I had to leave mine behind, way back past, that village with a mad woman." "Oh, yeah," nodded Sharmina. "I know the one." "Blooming cart's busted, ain't it? Last time I buy second hand, I tell you. Just lucky I didn't have no goods on it, else I'd be up the spout, know what I mean? So far up the spout, I'd be out the blooming spout and into the cup." Sharmina snorted and nodded knowingly. She had a good idea where he'd bought his cart from. Brian stood up straight and dusted himself down, ready for his entrance. "So what's a young lady such as yourself doing hanging around outside a place like this?" asked Brian, being the naturally nosy type. Sharmina, who had begun to put one and two together, answered with a question. "What about you? You said you didn't have no goods on your cart. You looking for something?" "Well," said Brian, "always on the lookout. Yeah, you been in there? Much going on?" "I think," mumbled Sharmina, peering through the window again, "it's about to get interesting." "Oh, lovely," said Brian, rubbing his hands. "Well, it's cold out here. You fancy a mug of something warming? Don't tell the wife. She's got me on a diet." Chapter 10. The Challenge. Impasse. Dean wouldn't budge, and neither would Nina. There was no getting around it. She had to have those pigs. Once she delivered the pigs, Micheal Inn had promised her more work. She was unlikely to get a better offer. The small table in front of the fireplace was now surrounded by 9 men and one dark-haired, annoyed-looking woman. The rest of the inn was either peering over, pointing, or telling their friends to look that way too. In one corner, a small band consisting of a fiddler, a spoon player, and a singer continued as if nothing was happening. Joe, the fiddler's daughter, stole a pig away for slaughter. She danced all night, she slept all day. The prince did come and whisk her away. "Oi, shut it, will you? I can't think!" screeched Nina at the hapless musicians. They stopped, stupefied by the fierceness of the retort. Nina barged her way through the men until she was stood in front of the table. There was a sudden hush, an eerie quiet, broken only by the creak of the front door as Brian and Sharmina entered. Nina waited for quiet again and then slowly, dramatically, scraped a chair from under the table. She fixed Dean with a stare and pointed to the other chair. He shuffled round until he was behind it. "What?" he asked. It came out very quietly, with that odd breathiness that happens when you don't quite catch your voice. "I'll challenge you for the pigs," stated Nina. "Challenge? How? What do I get if I win?" By means of an answer, Nina reached into her bag and slammed down a metal object onto the wooden table. Dean stretched over to look at it. "It's a key," he said matter-of-factly. He was right. It was a key, about the size of a hand. "It's the key to the storeroom of the kitchen of the Summer Palace." "What Summer Palace?" asked one of the men next to Dean. "The Summer Palace, you donkey," spat Nina. "How many Summer Palaces are there?" "The one at Baggio," said another man, nudging the first. Dean scratched his neck. He was distracted by having been called a donkey twice in one day. He stared at the key. He didn't understand. "Where'd you get that?" "Part from Baggio," marked Nina. "It's a copy of one from Micheal Inn." "I've heard of her," called out a few people. Nina continued unmoved. "The most famous chef in all South Nomasina. I imprinted her key into wax and got a local craftsman to mould it for me. It ain't cheap, and the stuff it gives you access to ain't cheap neither." "Ah," said Dean, nodding, accompanied by a small horde of fellow nodders. He pulled out the chair opposite. "In that case, what's your poison, missy?" "Landlord," cried Nina, "get us a bottle of Dangerous Dave's Firewater." A wave of gasps passed through the room. Gingerly, the landlord reached for a bottle of dark yellow liquid from the top but one shelf. "No," interrupted Nina. "The pink bottle, if you please." The gasps turned into shrieks. For that bottle, the landlord had to unlock a hidden cabinet from the top shelf. "Look, missy," advised one man, "you reckon you're being clever here, but you ain't. He may look drunk, but believe me, Dino here is only just getting started." The pink Firewater?" stuttered Dean. No one had actually tasted the pink bottle of Dangerous Dave's Firewater. It was a legend, nothing more. It would cost them everything they had. It was Nina's big throw of the dice. The landlord carefully placed the bottle on the table and waited for money from the duellers. Nina took advantage of the slight pause from Dean to taunt him. Reaching into her bag, she removed 2 round, hard, exotic fruits known to her as coconuts, although no one else there had ever seen their kind before. Sitting down, she held them in her hands just above the table at roughly chest height. "What's that, big boy? Seen something that scares you? You want these instead?" Guffaws and chortles and titters spread round the room. Dean brushed his hair back, cleared his throat, and threw down all the money he had. So did Nina. The duel was on. Brian had finally made it to the bar. "1 pint mash and 2 mugs of your finest ales, please, landlord," he said. He'd been dying to say that for hours. Chapter 11. Firewater. A waitress made her way to the table with 2 glazed pottery shot-sized cups. "No, no," said the landlord, preventing her from placing them on the table. "This calls for glasses." He produced 2 tiny drinking glasses from his person and placed them slowly in front of the competitors. "OK, here's the rules," he began. He had overseen events like this before in the Pheasant Plucker, though never before with the pink Firewater. "I don't know you two, so whoever has the smallest birthday goes first. You?" He pointed at Dean. "Dean," replied Dean. "Well, what day is your birthday on?" "I don't know," shrugged the cart salesman. The landlord looked at Nina. She shook her head as well. "Gods!" cursed the landlord. "What a pair! OK, you. Liza. What hand have I got a coin in?" "Left." "Right." "Oh," said Nina disappointedly. "No," replied the landlord. "You're right. Dean, you go first. First one spills a drink, or his head hits the table or the floor, loses, right? They nodded. The landlord poured. All right, Liza, said Dean, holding up his glass so that everyone could see the infernal pink liquid inside. Let's see what you're made of. Bottoms up. He swigged it back quickly. His head jerked slightly and his eyes shut and opened slowly. He let out a long, satisfied ah. Nina grabbed her glass defiantly. Here's to 5 fat pigs and a treasure trove full of palace goodies, she said. She'd done this before, though of course never with this particular drink, so she felt some semblance of confidence in her high-risk strategy. She slammed back the drink. It hit her throat like a hot poker and exploded inside her head. She thought she blacked out for a second, but she recovered and slammed the glass back on the table. Same again, please, landlord, she rasped. It had been difficult, but Sharmina had found herself a spot where she could see the table. Not much of it. She could see the back of Nina's head sometimes. She could see Nina's feet by her bag, and she saw her father's hands clutching his glass. She hadn't heard much due to the rambunctious nature of the clientele and their excitement at the event. She batted off all attention and attempts at conversation from anyone and kept to herself. Brian, on the other hand, was a natural chatterbox. He'd set up deals to supply flowers to temples, new shears for a sheep farmer, and promised that he could supply the town hall with roof tiles. As long as he kept the needy from the greedy, he could be the middleman for all of these. All he needed was a working cart. He didn't go near the contest in front of the fireplace, but he knew that Dean, the doyen of dodgy carts himself, was involved. There had to be a way to recoup his losses over the broken vehicle he'd had to leave behind. The fire flickered away, oblivious to the drama unfolding in its glow. Money was changing hands as bets flew one way and then the other. With each hit, one competitor looked as if they were about to fall, until such time as they recovered and revelled in their infamy. No one had thought either was going to last more than 2 shots of the deadly substance. Whilst Dean was known for his tolerance of the evil liquor, he had already imbibed slightly too much before embarking on this endeavour. His opponent, however, was an unknown quantity. She was but a young woman, and yet her confidence and the dark look in her dark brown eyes, sometimes hidden by the dark hair that dangled across her face as the evening wore on, lent her a formidable air of danger that many were wary to bet against. Nina just about managed to place her glass upright on the table. She wobbled. The landlord regarded them both. Dean's eyes definitely weren't coordinating at this point. He swallowed, then burped, and put his hand over his mouth. "Bucket on standby, Marie," called the landlord to one of his waitresses. No, it's okay," mumbled Dean incoherently. Pigs and keys, yeah, winning." "Pah!" spat back Nina. "Drink up, you pansy." The landlord gingerly poured another shot. "Number 7, he said, passing his eyes around the room. There was an intake of breath, and silence fell. "Hey, Sharmina," drawled Dean. Sharmina's ears pricked up as she thought she heard her name. "It's Nina, you Dumbo," called back Nina, forgetting that she'd called herself Liza. "Go on then, let's have you." The landlord shook his head. They were in a sorry state. He knew that breakfast hours would have to be extended in the morning. Still, it would be worth it. It had been a bumper night for takings at the Pheasant Plucker. Brian regarded the goings-on coolly from his perch at the bar. He had befriended the landlord's wife. "I'd get up to watch," he yawned, "but it's tricky after that 5th ale. And that 3rd pickled egg," she added, chuckling. "Yeah," agreed Brian. "If anyone wants to challenge me on them eggs, I'd be happy to oblige. You do make a great pickled egg, if you allow me to say." He raised a mug to his hostess. Dean was having trouble finding the glass on the table. There were so many to choose from. He tried one after the other until at last his fingers wrapped around something. He attempted to hold it in his gaze, but it kept jumping around. He decided to go for it. There was upward motion from his forearm, but angles and trajectories misaligned. The glass slammed into his cheek, spilling the expensive pink liquid down his neck. He managed before he lost control of his head, and it fell like a large, unruly cauldron from a top shelf, hitting the table with a dull thud. A roar, a mix of jubilation and pain, erupted from the audience, with the different noises being made dependent on who had been backing who. Nina beamed. "No!" yelled the landlord, spreading his arms out across the table. "She has to complete the 7th shot as well. Drink it and put the empty back on the table." A collective gasp. Liquid poured into glass. Nina's concentration face returned. Everyone leaned in. She lifted the glass carefully, put it to her lips. So far, so good. She winked at the landlord. The firewater oozed into her mouth. She removed it and she placed it on the table. Chapter 12. The Champion. The Pheasant Plucker erupted. They had a champion. Many, those who had lost bets, shook their heads in admiration and handed over cash. The band began playing again. She came from the country and she couldn't have less. They said she was a peasant but she became a princess. Nina's hand shot out and, at the second attempt, grabbed her precious key from the middle of the table. She leant down towards her bag and put her key inside it. At least, she thought she did, but she missed and the key slipped unnoticed onto the floor at her feet. Whilst her hands were down there, she found one of her lucky coconuts. "Woo!" she squealed, holding it high above her. "I'm the winner! Who wants a coconut?" Her outstretched arm rebelled at being requested to obey the commands of the brain that had sent it there. It was infused with Dangerous Dave's firewater, which impelled it to ignore instruction. The coconut slipped from its nest in the sky and obeyed the greater law of gravity, descending onto the head of Nina. She hadn't really felt anything for several minutes, the firewater having obliterated almost all of her senses, but she did briefly feel the force of a coconut boinking onto her exposed head. It was the last thing she felt that evening. The large tropical fruit clattered onto the table and then the floor, causing one man to slip over and knock another over and another. The spoon player in the band lost his spoons, and the lack of percussion in the song caused everyone to take stock. Looking back towards the competition table, they saw both entrants unconscious, face down beside an almost empty bottle of the most devastating drink known to the Sven kingdoms. Few had seen the incident, and those that did had a hard time explaining what they had seen. Were the bets now valid? Who was the victor? Would there have to be a rerun? Pandemonium. Brian and the landlady were chuckling about the whole situation, and he was patting his large tummy, wondering whether he could actually justify a 4th pickled egg to himself when he felt a tug on one shoulder. Turning around, he saw the face of the young lady he'd met at the door. "Oh, hello, love," chuckled Brian. "Where you been all evening? You missed the fun?" He knew he'd said the wrong thing by the urgent, desperate look on her face. "What is it?" he asked. "Come on," urged Sharmina. "Now's your chance." "For what?" asked Brian. He was very comfortable at that particular moment and didn't fancy moving much, less so into the melee that constituted the majority of the inn. Sharmina tutted, her eyes flying heavenwards. "Blimey, is everyone in here a drunken idiot?" she asked rhetorically. "That's Dean, innit? He sold you the busted cart, didn't he?" Brian nodded. "Well," she continued, "now's your chance to get something back from him." She moved into whispering range. "We get his cart and the pigs. We take 'em and sell 'em in Baggio at the What's-It." "The What's-It?" "Yeah, the Buster thingy." "Oh yeah, the food-a-me thing." Sharmina nodded enthusiastically. Brian frowned. "But that's a bit, dodgy." "And what's he done to you? Sold you a dud, ain't he? How much you lost?" Brian had to agree. He had wasted a lot of time and money recently, and while he could possibly make it up, some sort of get-rich-quick scheme would come in very handy now. It had to be better than buying and selling roof tiles. "But where do you fit into all this?" asked Brian. "I'm supposed to be delivering them pigs. Now he's gone and gambled away to that strumpet and I'm left with nothing." Blimey, we're both in a pickle, ain't we? Brian scratched his head, wondering what to do. But Sharmina wasn't wondering. Come on, she insisted, grabbing him by the arm and leading him into the maelstrom. Chapter 13. The Great Escape. Sharmina and Brian fought their way to the middle. The young lady had sharp elbows to go with her sharp tongue, and she soon cleared them a path to the table where the pair of prone drinkers half sat and half lay. Brian wasn't quite sure what the plan was. Right, we're taking these, screeched Sharmina at the landlord. And who are you, young madam? I'm his pleasing daughter, ain't I? She spat back. She got a quizzical look from Brian, to which he replied with a slight shake of the head and mouthing no. Got to get him off to bed. Lucky we got a driver, innit? She pointed to Brian. Brian started to get the idea. We might as well. He nodded down towards the dark-haired woman passed out opposite Dean. Be my guest, said the landlord. I've no idea who she is. Plonk her upstairs in room 6. It's spare. I'll get her, insisted Sharmina. Brian went to pick up Dean, hoisting him up under the arms. His head lolled back and he called out, Sharmina, before his eyes closed again. You what? Asked Brian. Sharmina leant over to Brian. He said, Nina. That's me. Come on, get a move on. As Brian dragged Dean away, several customers patted his unconscious body or laughed and pointed. Sharmina half walked, half dragged Nina, who mumbled incoherently. Sharmina directed Brian to Dean's room, then followed with Nina, and they placed them together on the bed. Ha! That'll teach him to drink like that, chortled Brian. Now what? Sharmina extracted the certificate from Dean. We'll be needing that, she said. Now, we go. I'll lock 'em in. How? Asked Brian. With the key, of course, answered Sharmina. Got it off the landlord. I didn't see him give you a key. Neither did he. They made their escape whilst the clientele was still enjoying their final drinks of an exciting evening. The stable boy was paid off, and then they were off into the night. Chapter 14. Bustle and Hustle. Baggio was bustling. It wasn't one of the great cities of Messina, but with the summer palace, it was guaranteed that the upper echelons of the royal family would be in town for basta mal pasta. And with them came the gentry, the upper classes, the moneyed. The town's population was busy trebling as the festival started. I hope them pigs will be worth the trouble. They don't half take some feeding, and I'm no farmer, I tell you. I mean, it starts with the pigs. Where's it going to end up? Be bloomin' goats next, butting their way around the place, giving me bruises. Brian was not the contemplative type. He didn't do thoughtful silences. Sharmina tried for the umpteenth time to ignore him. If she hadn't been relishing the freedom from her father, she'd have told him to shut up. She would have stamped her feet and screamed and scowled and sneered and lashed out. In fact, she almost missed doing all of those things that she used to inflict upon her dad. Not that he didn't deserve it, the filthy, stealing, selfish whatnot. Hang about, see what I see, said Brian, pulling on the reins and stopping the cart on the side of a busy street. Sharmina looked up, but kept her head in her hands. The palace, said Brian triumphantly. Almost there. Sharmina came to life. Right, she said, extracting the certificate from her person. So, you're Dean, okay? It's got Dean written on here. Brian looked over. Yeah, but I'm Brian, ain't I? I don't want to be Dean. Why not? Because if this comes off, I could be the supplier here. I could end up running the show, or some of it. Buying, selling, delivering. I don't want them looking for Dean. It's Brian. Sharmina, knowing the truth about the certificate, shrugged. Fair enough, she said. I can change it. Give me a moment. She laid the paper on the cart's front bench between them and, finding her quill, carefully added a section to the D, changing it to a B. She did the same, transforming the E to an R, also using her trusty vial of lemon and gin to rub part out. She squeezed an I in the middle. There you go. Brian. Easy money. Brian nodded approvingly and geed the horse along. And if you don't mind me asking, Miss Nina, what'd you get out of this? He asked. I mean, apart from sticking one on Dean. Sharmina shrugged. Just give me in a palace. The streets began to narrow as more and more stalls appeared. Getting to the palace in a cart would be impossible. People shouted and gesticulated at them for taking up space. In one way it was a trader's paradise, but in another it was a nightmare. For a start, Sharmina was winging it and had no idea if the pigs were for someone specific or if they were intended just for general trade. Many people just avoided them, holding their noses or waving them away as they saw the pigs. Others were more interested, shouting questions about were they clean, how much were they worth, where were they from. However, the intrepid Hugheslezians continued their stubborn trip to the palace. "You sure you don't know who the buyer is?" "I told you, Dean knew that," lied Sharmina. "You just get us there." "OK, hold your horses," chuckled Brian. "I'll get you there. If anyone can find out who they're for, it's me. Gift of the gab, see? I can talk to them, man to man, negotiate, parley, make inquiries, extract information." "All right, yes," butted in Sharmina, irritated by the sound of his voice. That was when they noticed they were stuck. There was another horse-drawn cart in front of them, attempting to make it away from the even more crowded town centre, blocking their route. Apparently it was supposed to be one way. A crowd gathered, hurling insults and a few vegetables. Sharmina retaliated with a few choice, unprintable words, suggesting that the people around her had dubious relations with her own family and really ought to depart in a most hasty and unclean fashion. Brian tried to calm the situation, but it was clear that backing up in the crowded market street would take some time and upset a lot of people. It was very frustrating, as they could see some of the palace from where they were. 4 members of the king's cavalry arrived. They were impeccably dressed in light blue uniforms with shiny buckles and belts, plumes on their long helmets, and gleaming silver swords. "Hey, you there! Mamma mia, what do? You block the road. This one way only," called out their leader above the din to Brian. "Sorry, mate, got a delivery for the palace, special like." The captain peered around Brian and caught sight of the agitated pigs in the back. "What are this? Who this for?" "The palace, the big meal, you know," replied Brian, tapping his nose as if to conscript the captain into his conspiracy. "What are your names?" asked the captain. "Brian, sir, and Nina." "Nina? Bobbity boppity, you here for Micheal?" "Micheal?" "Michealine." Brian had heard this name. "Yeah, her of the flat buck, that one," he replied, naming the famous restaurant she ran. Personally, he'd never get on with restaurants. He couldn't see the point. No ale, no pickled eggs, no bar, no big fireplace or fiddlers singing rude songs. Only sitting around eating expensive food. Still, he'd always wanted to get in on the supply game to the flat buck. They paid top prices. This could work out better than he'd expected. Yes, said the captain, and he began flapping his hands around and shouting orders. Much to the chagrin of the local population, they were now given precedence, and everyone had to back up to allow them the wrong way up the street and on to the palace. Sharmina took it as an opportunity to exchange rude hand signs with everyone. The summer palace was, to coin a phrase, palatial. Brian had once been to the only palace of Hughesles. It looked like someone had stopped caring for it about 50 years earlier. A few cracks gave way to vines and weeds, and a dirty creek ran past, close to little villages that clung to its ramparts like starving limpets. Unwashed soldiers hung about inside, and it smelt of city streets and decaying food. By contrast, he and his accomplice entered another world. The encircling wall was just the beginning. Beyond that was a freshly gravelled road through flowered gardens that led to the palace itself. The turrets gleamed, patrolled by immaculately turned-out guards, their plumes swaying gently as they paraded along the ramparts. People everywhere were sweeping, cleaning, and organising. They stared open-mouthed. As Brian was, for once, dumbstruck, it was Sharmina who spoke first. "So, if this is the summer palace, does that mean there's one for every season?" "Blimey, love, you must be right. It's beyond." He didn't get a chance to finish. They arrived at the inner gate. A shortish, plump man with a bald head and a moustache, flanked by guards, stopped them and beckoned Brian to descend. "Welcome," he said. "My name is Mario. I am the equerry here." Replied Brian, not knowing what that meant. The man huffed in frustration. Nothing happen here without my knowing. Whatever come in must be proper. Where's the certificate for these creatures?" Sharmina passed down the certificate, then continued her admiration of her surroundings and of the smart guards. "All in good order, sir," said Brian deferentially. Mario looked down at his nose, but eventually seemed to agree. "So, where's herself then, the great chef?" asked Brian. "She is busy now. You will take the pigs through to the slaughterhouse, then my men will escort you back to the street." Only I was hoping I could have a word, conclude some business. I do a lot of buying and selling myself. I thought her and I could have a little chinwag." Mario fluttered his hand up and down to curtail Brian's ramblings. "You are Brian?" he asked, looking once more at the paper in his hand. "Oh yes, Brian, that's me. Brian's the name. Supplying kitchens is me game." Chapter 15. The Morning After. The body beneath the blanket thrashed out, trying to find air. Went the other body, seemingly in response. "Oh, no!" wailed the first body, belonging to Nina, as she finally found a way out of the horrific stench that had erupted beneath the blanket. Her head emerged into the light. There was hair on her chin, but it didn't belong to her. It was sprouting from some foreign body. She moaned in disgust and shook her head away. Bad idea. Her head was in no shape to be moved, let alone suddenly. She tried to move her legs, but they seemed to be wrapped up in some other hairy things. "Ah!" she gasped as she looked down and saw that it was a male body sprawled all over her. She tried to say something more coherent, but it was very difficult. Her mouth was achingly dry and had a strange taste. Sour, bitter. She couldn't quite make it out. Confusion reigned. Even thinking hurt. What or who was this man with whom she was entwined against her will? The man began snoring. Then he let out another noise from further down his body. That was it. She had to move. When she did, the whole room seemed to move with her. She felt like she was having both a biological and existential emergency at the same time. What had she done to get into this state? What in all the Sven kingdoms could have occurred? Surely she didn't deserve this. Gingerly she attempted to kick away the mail strewn all over the bed. It wasn't working. She had no choice but to attempt something more violent. Summoning all her available strength, she pushed and thrashed at the man, disgusted by the touch and smell of him. She found herself tumbling very briefly and with, to her delicate ears, a deafening thud. She hit the wooden floor. She cried out silently. There was pain leaking from every pore in her body. She began to remember. The man gasped. Then he shrieked. He too was in pain. With short, sharp pants, he lifted himself carefully into sitting position. His eyes flinched at the light. He made out a figure, a face perhaps, staring at him from the floor. "What the—" he began. Nina groaned incoherently. "Water," gasped Dean. "You," managed Nina quietly. "Who are you?" "What are you doing here? Where's—" Nina stumbled over her words, her throat hurting from dehydration. "Where's my pigs?" "Pigs? What?" Dean looked around slowly. "Sharmina," he muttered. "No, I'm Sarah." Nina began to move. She had to do something. "You don't remember, do you? I won them pigs last night. Got to get out." Nah, muttered Dean. "Take it easy, girl. Water. Cup of tea." "Bugger the tea. I got a bit—" Nina felt sick as she stood up. She lurched over to her cloth bag. With shaky, fumbling hands, she felt around inside. She couldn't find what she was after. No, she screamed. Dean put his head in his hands. "Oh, what is it?" My key! Key? Dean shook his head and then thought better of it. He decided not to move or think any more. Nina, however, was up. She staggered to the door and grabbed the handle. It turned, but it wouldn't pull open. Something was very wrong. She was locked inside a small room with a stinking, horrible man and someone had taken her key to the summer palace kitchen storeroom. "Let me out!" she hollered as best she could, and banged on the door in desperation. Chapter 16. Sharmina the Charmer. 3 guards escorted Brian and Sharmina out, but there was quite a wait at one of the large gates. Sharmina ignored Brian and took the opportunity to flirt with the handsome, impeccably dressed guards, who seemed inexplicably charmed by her delightful foreign accent. Brian grumped, perturbed that he'd not been able to meet the great chef, and that he'd been so unceremoniously turned away from having made the delivery. However, the payment was good, and the town was obviously a place full of opportunity, and the woman he knew as Nina hadn't taken her payment. In fact, Sharmina was so unconcerned about the payment that she descended the cart. Brian only noticed when one of the guards banged on the side and told him to move on. Brian briefly looked around for his companion/conspirator and caught a last glimpse of her, each of her arms linked with a guard. He took the opportunity to scarper with the cash and see what he could accomplish in the town. The missus would certainly be appreciative of something fancy to wear. The only problem might be finding her size. Everyone in Baggio seemed so lean and toned. Not his type, really. He trotted away. Sharmina had wormed her way into the summer palace. Surrounded by jewels and vines and paintings and gardens and servants and uniforms, she was in absolute heaven. It got even better when she was taken to the mews. She could indulge in her fantasy of owning her own horse. She was so enraptured she had almost forgotten her prized possession, the key. On remembering she had it, she put it to good use. She sneaked away to go and see what lay in the storeroom, but it was in constant use. Everyone was preparing for Micheal Inn's banquet. What do you do here, peasant girl?" asked a snotty-nosed man in a white apron. "You watch your mouth, mister. I've been sent here by Mario, ain't I? I travelled 9 days to get here." The man looked unimpressed. He slammed the door shut and locked it. Sharmina took this as a personal affront and decided to show him who was boss. As calm as a palm tree in summer, she removed her copy of the key from its pocket and, keeping her eyes fixed on her enemy, she reopened the large wooden door, opening it slowly so that it opened with a dramatic creak. His expression turned from haughty superiority to panicked civility. But who? Miss Inn give it me. Special instructions. Only me allowed in there." He stood dumbfounded. "Well, bugger off then," she added for good measure. Had Nina broken in as she had intended, her prey would have been silver utensils, cleavers, knives, gold-plated forks, vintage wines, scales, anything valuable. Sharmina selected a delicate flower-patterned tablecloth and wrapped it around herself alluringly, dumping her old clothes at the back of a shelf. She took some bread, pâté, some wine, and a drink that she found. She didn't know what it was, but it was crammed full of sugar. "Ah, sweet," she said, smacking her lips. She also found some biscuits and cake. "One party coming right up," she said to herself, and set off to find her friends in the mews again. Chapter 17. The other morning after. Micheal's day had been a whirlwind. The pigs had arrived in time. This was good news for the fish that had been on standby. They continued swimming in blissfully ignorant circles in a large pond near the kitchen. She had more staff than she could shake a ladle at, and whilst it had been challenging, it had also been thrilling. This was what she was made for. The roaring ovens and fireplaces, the clatter of plates, the shouted orders, the controlled mayhem behind the scenes that produced a flawless display of food into the banqueting hall. There were generals, dukes, duchesses, lords and ladies, captains of industry, and even a princess. They ate 7 courses, from starters to desserts, including the triumph of the main pork dish, which had been requested and delivered. Despite some minor hiccups with some missing pâtés and biscuits, it had all gone as smoothly as she could have hoped for. When she presented herself at the end of the evening, the applause was rapturous. The long table of distinguished guests rose from their seats to show their appreciation. The princess, insisted that she must cook the next day for her brother, and now de facto ruler of Nomesina, Prince Fernando. Micheal humbly accepted. It started with a rumble, a sound like a cow blowing bubbles while submerged in a chocolate lake. Not the sort of sound one would want to hear from the lower half of one's body. Not when one is spending the night in a palace in a bed probably as expensive as one's own not inexpensive country retreat. Duke Toromalenko was greatly worried. He didn't know how to get to the toilet on time without taking the chance of ruining the carpet. He'd heard it had been imported across thousands of miles of sea from a people who wore cloths on their head. He looked at his wife. She seemed to have turned yellow overnight. She squealed from the pain in her abdomen. In other rooms, it was a racing heartbeat, a fever, or many other symptoms which are best left unsaid. The Duke made a bolt for it, attempting to get to the little room on the other side of the corridor. He didn't dare use the window as he might in his country retreat. Unfortunately, he was in such a rush that he collided with a lady. They were both too late, as the small room was already occupied. Their collision and the state of their health had consequences for the previously impeccable decor of the southeastern wing. A maid screamed in terror and turned and ran. She was blocked by zombie-like figures lurching down the hallway, clutching their stomachs, behinds, and heads. The Duke and the lady accepted their fate and sat down to console each other. "What a morning, oh my," exclaimed the lady. "Oh, mamma, yes," moaned the Duke. "First my man does not turn up to take my avocados and lemons for export, and now this." He went to put his head in his hands, but thought better of it. Prince Fernando arrived at the palace to a maelstrom, a catastrophe, a pig's ear, you might be tempted to say. His sister looked like death warmed up, as did the upper echelons of Nomesinan society who had all attended the dinner. "Mario!" he screamed. A dozen servants scattered immediately to find the equerry. Mario, when eventually found, was in full-on grovel mode, stuttering incomprehensibly. Young Fernando grabbed and shook him until the poor man stopped shaking and blubbering. "Tell me, my dear man, they ate pigs last night, no?" Mario nodded. "And where exactly did you get these pigs?" "Useless, your majesty, Nina and Brian." "Useless," spat Fernando. "I knew it! It is the fault of that stupid king." No, majesty, I think..." "You think of nothing. Mamma mia, you have been deceived by a forged certificate." "You are no capable of thinking, you stupido man." Yes, no, majesty." Mario's head wobbled, unsure whether to nod or shake. Fernando cast the disgraced equerry to the ground. He turned to assembled courtiers, guards, and servants. "Find that Brian! Bring him to me! Bring me the head of the chef, and ready the cavalry for an attack on Huesles!" He stormed off, followed only by his most trusted adviser, another bald-headed, mustachioed man named Mario, though this one was tall, lean, and much older than the prince he served. Mario, bubbidi-bubbidi, I have not been gone long, and look what happens." "So true, your majesty. Your people need you. I shall bring order from the chaos for you. Worry not." "Yes, Mario," replied Fernando, striding through the cloisters and courtyards on his way to he knew not where. "I need peace and quiet, things to soothe my soul. I need beauty and repose and elegance and renewal. I need..." He stopped, not sure how to take in what he saw, since he had never seen its like. He stood dumbstruck before the beauty, the elegance, the repose, the simple quietness. There is no doubt that chefing has always been a cutthroat business, never more so than at a major food festival in a rich, flamboyant, cultured, and powerful kingdom. Whilst the elite of society certainly appreciated good food and looked all very dandy in their best outfits, Nomesina was not the place to offend the aristocracy. They were given to lashing out and holding grudges. They loved a good scapegoat, and right then Micheal was their woman. Micheal, though, whilst an ambitious and talented chef, was no monster. She was naturally outgoing and talkative, and prone to making friends. Thankfully, this was her saving grace. As panic spread throughout the accommodation suites of the VIP guests, word spread quickly in the lower reaches of the palace. She knew her dream had been dashed. It was the end of her life as she knew it, and new plans would have to be made, or at least improvised on the spot. She grabbed what possessions she could, and shoving them into a sack, bunched her hair up inside a hat, smeared some dirt on her face, and bolted. Her escape was helped by those under-chefs that she had worked with, who admired her talent and the way she encouraged them and showed them what to do, rather than just lashing out like many other egotistical chefs would do. Once on the streets, she could blend in and hide, get as far away as possible from the palace. Where would be safest? Of course, no Nomesinan would willingly go to Hughesles. She turned east. Sharmina had had quite a night of it. Her takings from the storeroom had proved to be a hit with the collection of stable boys and off-duty guards. As the banquet began for the great and good, the rest of them coagulated around Sharmina, with ladies-in-waiting and washerwomen and tradesmen bringing more food and drink, children and musical instruments. She lost track of time, revelling in her freedom. No one there shouted at her with ale-soaked breath, or put her down, or told her she was no good. Even though she was a foreigner, she was welcome. In fact, their differences provoked laughter and talk as the night wore on. Somehow, she knew she had to stay. She'd escaped, and she definitely wasn't going back. It was a combination of light and noise that woke her. Feet clattered impatiently and voices were raised. She thought about opening an eye and tried to figure out where she had landed up. She could feel the morning sun on her skin. Fernando put his hand up to stop his entourage. He crept forward to observe the vision of beauty at closer quarters. It was a young lady wrapped in an alluring flowery cloth, as if it was something she had found, not a tailored thing. This made Fernando's romantic heart flutter. What untamed soul lay within? She was lying on the rim of a fountain. The dripping water reflected the nascent sunlight onto her exposed skin, skipping, dancing. Something in him had switched. Sharmina yawned and stretched out her arms and a leg. "Oh, blimey," she said as she felt the cloth slipping away. There was a small hubbub of embarrassed coughing, so she decided to finally open an eye. There was a face staring at her. It was blurry, so she rubbed her eyes. "Oh, hello, handsome," she said to the face, which smiled back. "Please, your majesty," butted in Mario, trying to break the spell he'd seen emerging. "She is but a peasant girl from Hughesles, of all places. Probably just a temporary worker. I shall have her replaced." Prince Fernando swung round in fury. "How dare you, Mario? You will do no such a thing. Mamma mia, how can you think of disturbing this beautiful woman from her repose?" Mario opened his mouth to reply. "No! No more from you," insisted his boss. "And I will hear no more against Hughesles for the day." "The cavalry?" "I told you, no more! You no talk." Mario flinched. No one had seen Mario flinch before. He was the king's advisor and probably the most powerful and influential man in the kingdom. Satisfied, Fernando turned around again to face Sharmina, once more adopting a softer, gentler outlook. "Yeah, you told him, didn't you?" said Sharmina, yawning again. "By the way, where am I? I'm supposed to be, where was it? Something about a job." "A job?" gasped Fernando. "You will do no such thing, lady. You will be my guest, my honoured guest." "Oh, very nice," replied Sharmina, sitting up and adjusting her make-do clothing. She wondered who the man was. He had a lot of people standing round, seemingly waiting on his orders. "May I inquire as to your name, my lady?" She liked the way he called her his lady. She wondered if he had any horses. She did so love horses, and hoped that one day she could ride one all of her own. He had some very expensive clothes on. The buckles on his shoes looked as if they were gold, as did some rings on his fingers, and there was a very shiny necklace dangling from his neck, and he was quite handsome. She wondered whether to call herself Nina, or something more in keeping with her surroundings, but she remembered that the other man had already figured where she was from. She had nothing to lose. "Sharmina," she said, holding out a hand. "Pleased to meet you." Her hand was taken and very gently kissed. She couldn't help letting out a small giggle. This seemed to impress the man. "And you are?" she asked in her poshest voice. "I, my lady, am Prince Fernando of Messina, and I am most honoured to welcome you to my palace." "Blimey," muttered Sharmina, as the prince led her away. The end.